Hey guys, Lazy here. Well, that upcoming video is taking a little longer than I planned to make, so I figured it would be nice to put out a compilation of my favourite stories from the past few months, since I can piece these things together in a flash. And hey, maybe there's a few you missed. I guess this one's more for the people who fall asleep listening to the stories, or just like to relax with them on. Anyway, enough blabbering. Enjoy the video, and remember, the best things happen in the dark. Many years ago now, I lived in Florida with my then fiancée, Claire. She was my high school sweetheart and the love of my life. A small, petite little thing who couldn't scare a mouse even if she wanted to. Not that she would. She's got a heart of gold. Money was tight for us back then, and I worked night shifts at a gas station to help ease our financial woes. It goes without saying that I hated the hours, but it paid decently, and at a time when I'd have sold my left nut to eat a nice meal at a restaurant rather than have another microwave meal, who was I to complain? It was while working there that I met Angela, a customer who I became friendly with over the course of a couple of weeks. She was a decently attractive girl, a few years my senior and a bit overweight, but she appeared to be a normal, funny person. That's the thing with people who plan on screwing up your life. They don't come to you as a mindless crazy. Those people you know not to interact with. But because of how ordinary Angela appeared to be, I started chatting with her every time she came into the store. In hindsight, it was a little strange that this woman would come to the store every night and spend a good long while just chatting with me. Most times not even buying anything. But the night shifts were dull, and I guess I welcomed the company. She had always come in at those weird hours because of her insomnia. She refused to take sleeping pills or anything like that because she hated the idea of taking drugs. Funny. The more and more she came into the store, the more I started to realize that she probably wasn't taking some other types of drugs that she should be. After a while, cracks started to appear. I don't know whether she felt comfortable enough around me to let out her real self, or she just couldn't contain that level of crazy any longer. It was the way she acted, and the strange things she said. Like how she had bet that my blood smelled really nice, like a perfume. She had dropped these lines into casual conversation. At some point, I must have made it obvious that I wasn't single, because she asked me what my girl's name was. I didn't want to give her real name, so I just made one up on the spot. Phoebe. I guess I'd been watching Friends that week. It became apparent that Angela was obsessed with me. That's not my ego talking. She literally confessed that she was in love with me and wanted to have my babies. Sorry. I just told you about my fiancé. Her face didn't change, like that wasn't even an issue. So, no can do. How serious can it be? I don't even see an engagement ring, she replied. Well, money's tight. We haven't even set a date for the wedding yet, so... Without hesitation, she blurts out, I'll give you $200 to fuck me. Double if you get me pregnant. Anything you want if you dump your whore of a fiancé. Shell-shocked, I muttered, Get out, please. With that, she left the store. She didn't come in the following night, or the night after that. Well, I guess she got the message, I thought to myself. A couple more days pass, and it's a Saturday afternoon. I'd been out by myself walking our dog, Albert, and was on my way back home, since my parents were coming over to our place for a late lunch. When I arrive back home, Claire fills me in on something. Apparently, some woman had come to the door and was asking to talk to me. Said that she was one of my co-workers. She also greeted my fiancée as Phoebe. Shit, Angela's found where I live. I explained to Claire who this nutjob was, and that she was obsessed with me. Thankfully, she knew me well enough to know that I wasn't having an affair behind her back. Being the trusting person she was, Claire invited Angela in, telling her I'd be back soon. She followed her inside to wait for me. Thankfully, my parents and a couple of family friends were already there. At one point, whilst waiting for me to get back, Claire went to use the bathroom. When she came back down, Angela had gone. Just walked out without saying a word, according to the others. I hated the fact that Angela knew where I lived, and that she'd been stalking me. I considered calling the police, but stupidly, I decided to think it over instead. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful, and went by far too quickly. My shift was starting soon, and I was dreading the inevitable return of Angela, back with a vengeance. Claire was already in bed when it came time for me to leave. Just as I was getting ready to head out, I noticed Albert was sniffing at one of the small closet doors, scratching at it and whimpering. Great, we've got rats, I assumed. Come on, Albert, let's take a look then. I opened the closet, and there was Angela, crouched down in the small space under the stairs. Her eyes were wild. One of her hands was clasped over her mouth to hush her breathing. In the other, she held a small knife. You bet your ass that I didn't hesitate to call the police now. Thankfully, she dropped the knife pretty much instantly, and didn't put up much resistance, just bad-mouthing my fiancée, calling her an ugly whore, and begging me to give her a shot instead, as if saying all this would make the situation better for her in some way. The cops arrived, and took her away with little trouble, Claire in tears at the whole situation, me shaking due to a mixture of rage, fear, and confusion. Angela admitted to everything. According to her confession, she knew that I was out of the house when she knocked on the door. That was her plan all along. She hadn't come to talk to me. She came to murder my fiancé. She had brought that concealed knife with her to do so. In her mind, with Claire out of the picture, I'd be all hers, and we'd run away together. What she didn't know was that my parents and our family friends were there too. She followed me in her car to make sure I'd be gone long enough, during which time our guests arrived. When she saw them inside, she knew that she'd have to wait. When Claire went to the bathroom, Angela left the room with my parents in. But she didn't walk out the front door as everyone assumed. Instead, she quietly stowed herself away in that small closet, waiting for the others to leave. She knew my shifts like the back of her hand, so when I returned to the house, she figured she'd wait until I went to work. That way the house would be nice and empty, and at that point she'd be able to murder my fiancé. Along with the blade, she had brought a whole bunch of pictures of me, taken without my knowledge. They were of me inside the store, taken from outside, of me in the car, of me just walking around town. This woman had literally been chronicling my everyday life since I met her. Why she brought the photos along with her, I have no idea. It's extremely creepy to think that she was in that house with us the entire day, especially when you consider what she was planning. We moved out of state not long after this, not because we thought Angela might escape and come after us again, but because Claire didn't feel at home in that house anymore, as if it was tainted by Angela's actions. As I said, this all took place many years ago, and I can now happily say that Claire and I did eventually get married. We now have 2 beautiful children, and the whole Angela incident is far behind us. Though I still lay awake at night sometimes, thinking about how everything you hold dear in this world can be taken away from you by some lunatic. It's only pure dumb luck that I noticed Albert's whining, and just before I left as well. What would have happened had I actually left for work doesn't bear thinking about. I took in a puppy a few months ago. Her original owners weren't able to bond with her, said she was unresponsive and disobedient, and didn't have the look they wanted. I've got no idea what they were talking about. She's the best behaved dog I've ever known, and she's downright adorable, so I'm used to people stopping me in the street so they can pet her. Usually, people will ask before they touch her, or at the very least, they'll say something like, "Oh my god, look at that dog," to let you know they're obviously gonna come over and say hi to her. I'm pretty much fine with that. What I'm not fine with is what happened on one of my earlier walks with her. I live in a tiny seaside town, one of those places where the location is beautiful but the locals are racist, and I kind of take my dog on a tour of all the areas closest to the sea when I walk her. We'll walk along the beach, down the promenade, around the miniature lakes, and then home. Probably not smart to stick to the same route every day, but I've switched things up since then. Anyway, we were at the final stage of our walk, making a couple of laps around the secluded lakes, when we walked past a man. Now, a lot of old men gather there on a regular basis. I didn't think much of one dude sitting on a bench by the water. I told myself he was staring because my dog was cute. I just passed him by. Then, from behind me, I hear him say, "Sit." And my dog, who is much more obedient than her previous owners led on, sits down and looks up at me, all happy and expecting a treat. I frown back at the guy, see that he's still on the bench, and quickly encourage my puppy to start walking again. We haven't even got 5 feet further down the path before the guy says, "Sit," and my dog does. I turn around again, already glaring, and see that the man is now on his feet. I tell my dog to keep walking and pick up my pace, trying to get over to the path that leads up to the main street, away from this empty place. We're still nowhere near the path when the man yells, "Sit," and again my dog does. She's starting to look confused, but I'm pretty much terrified. He's coming over to us, and he's catching up fairly quickly. He's close enough that even without my glasses on, I can tell that he's grinning. At that point, I'd had enough. I forget about getting to the path, just scooped up my dog off the ground, ran straight up the hill to the side of us, and climbed over the little fence that separates the lakes from the street. The man didn't follow, but stayed at the bottom of the hill, looking up at us, not smiling anymore. I'd never seen him before, and haven't seen him since, and I hope it stays that way. I don't know exactly what his intentions were, but it seemed to me like he was using my dog's obedience to slow me down, to keep me from getting away from him. So I doubt they were good. Glad I didn't stick around to find out. This is a story told to me by my friend, and he maintains that it's completely true. He knew one of the people involved. I've heard of things like this happening before, and it's as interesting as it is disturbing to think about. It might start to sound a bit crazy, but stick with it. This story's about a 28-year-old guy called Kevin, as well as Kevin's girlfriend, another man named Bruce, and his girlfriend too. It was a weekend night in the midst of summer, and the two couples had been on a trip to the beach. Kevin had his own motorbike, and the rest were in a car being driven by Bruce. It was getting late, and there were no other cars in sight, so Bruce challenges Kevin to a race back home. Stupid? Sure, but there wasn't far to go, and the roads seemed deserted. Bruce and Kevin's apartments were in the same building. In fact, that was how they originally met, and they became close quickly. Not a guy to turn down a challenge, the engine roars, and Kevin's bike starts to accelerate. The first to arrive back was the car. At this point, it was around midnight. Elated, Bruce and his girlfriend jump out of the car and head right back to their room. But Kevin's girlfriend was worried. She knew that Kevin was a whiz on his bike. He should have arrived back way before them. She called him a couple of times, but assuming he was busy driving, she left a voicemail and headed upstairs. A few hours later, there was a fierce knocking on the door. Bruce and his girlfriend were standing outside with forlorn faces. Bruce opens up his mouth to speak, but the words won't come out. Eventually, it was his girlfriend who spoke up. Kevin got into an accident on the way back. He's dead. Kevin had approached a sharp bend in the road too quickly, and the rest goes without saying. Like I said, she was worried before, and the prospect had occurred to her, but she had just willed herself into believing that couldn't be the case. But it was. She just fell to the floor in tears. They tried to console her as best as they could, but that was when Bruce said something very strange. Listen, don't freak out, but I think the cops may have made a mistake. See, Kevin came by our room. The pair were shivering despite the hot summer air. Kevin's mum had just called us up and told us what happened. I told her we'd break the news to you. When I hung up, we heard a knocking at the door. We asked who it was, and it was Kevin. We thought he was playing some kind of sick joke on us at first, but his mum wouldn't have lied about something like that. We were scared, so we didn't open the door. Eventually, we heard footsteps, and he went away. She, of course, couldn't believe what they had told her, but they were being deadly serious. They both seemed convinced that Kevin's ghost had come to say goodbye or something. Even if they really believe that to be the case, it still seems like a pretty insensitive thing to say to someone who's just lost their boyfriend. But what's weirder is that before they left, they said that if Kevin came knocking on her door, she mustn't open it, no matter what, like a warning. Needless to say, this whole ordeal freaked her the hell out. In shock, she spent the whole next day locked in her room, mourning the death of Kevin. Eventually, she managed to cry herself to sleep. That night, she woke up to the sound of knocking. Thinking that her mind was playing tricks on her, she pulled the bedsheets over herself and desperately tried to fall back into sleep. The knocking continued, and this time whoever was knocking spoke. "Hey, it's me. Open the door." It was unmistakably Kevin's voice. Crazy, right? Well, that's the thing. Though it obviously made no logical sense, the whole scenario somehow felt completely natural to her. She approached the door carefully, compelled to answer his call. The closer she got to the door, the more she felt Kevin's presence. "Please, open the door." She felt tears brimming up as she reached for the handle. But this was nuts. After all, he was dead. She desperately tried to communicate with Kevin, or whoever or whatever was behind the door. "You're already dead," she shouted. The knocking got louder. "You're already dead, Kevin." But the knocking continued, and the shouting just became louder and louder. She couldn't help but cry even more. The thought that Kevin may somehow still be suffering, or desperate to say goodbye, was more than she could bear. That was it. She flung open the door and shouted for him at the top of her voice. And then she woke up. She had been in a coma. When she came to, she found herself in a brightly lit hospital room. Next to her bed sat Kevin, who was crying in relief. She felt weak and couldn't comprehend what was happening. Kevin elaborated. In reality, he had arrived back at the apartment before the others, but became worried when they seemingly took forever to catch up. He went back down the same route, only to find Bruce's car obliterated just after a sharp bend. Both Bruce and his girlfriend were literally in pieces, but she somehow survived. She was the only one in the back seat. Maybe this was all just an extremely vivid and involved dream that she was having whilst in the coma. She maintains that it was undeniably more real than that she and the others were someplace else, and that Kevin hadn't come to say goodbye, but to try and bring them back. However you choose to rationalize this, she remains convinced that if she had listened to Bruce's advice and not opened the door, she wouldn't have woken up. This took place a few years ago, while I was living with my parents. It's the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m. I step outside for a cigarette, and since my mum absolutely hates the things, I had to sneak out back by the woods. As I'm standing there, smoking, I notice a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It's my neighbour, Sean. What's he doing out here at this hour? He's looking right at me. I wave at him, and he just stands there, motionless. All of a sudden, it's hard to breathe. The air seems thick, and has a metallic smell to it, the same way that pennies taste. This was a really eerie situation, but I kick myself for being such a scaredy cat, and take another drag on my cigarette. As I do, the smoke gets in my eyes, and those of you who've had this happen will know that it stings like a bitch. I'm forced to close my eyes and rub them for what couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I open my eyes, and Sean is standing closer to me. Like in the brief moment that my eyes were shut, he'd walked from the edge of the woods towards me, and then stopped and stood motionless again. What the hell's he doing in the forest anyway? What is this? He waves at me, but it's like he's jerking his arm rather than moving it fluidly, like he's not sure what he's doing with it. I don't take my eyes off him as I put out my cigarette and back up into the house. His eyes are fixated on me the entire way. I shut the door and quickly move to the window to peek out and see what he's up to. He's right there, maybe 10 or 15 yards away from the house now, still staring right at me. I lock the door. Hell, I start locking every damn door in the house. When I'm finished, I go to check the basement door. He's right there, standing at the window, looking in and staring at me still. He does that jerking wave. Now that he's up close, I could see that something was wrong with him. It was Sean, but at the same time, it wasn't. Like someone had copy and pasted him into reality, but didn't make a perfect match. The instant I saw his face up close, his jaw drooping open, that uncanny valley sensation consumed me. I let forth a scream that would wake the dead, and sprinted upstairs, where I encounter my stepdad, who asks me what the fuck's going on. I tell him there's someone outside, and he grabs his gun and goes to check. No one's there. The next day, I ask Sean about it. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. At the time, I'd never heard of skinwalkers, but after reading about them, I'm almost 100% sure that this was one of them. This is a story from roughly 5 years ago. You might think I sound like a bit of a dick at certain points, but I think it's important that I don't sugarcoat things and just be honest. If nothing else, I hope you can respect that. I was 17 and still in high school at the time. At the start of the year, a girl joined our class from a different school. Considering our age, and how difficult it is to make friends halfway through high school, I figured that she must have been forced to move because of her dad's job or something. This girl was good looking and clever, like really smart, and it wasn't long before she became popular, particularly with the guys. I don't dare give her actual name, in case this story ever finds its way to her. Let's just call her Rin. Honestly, I didn't pay much attention to Rin at first. I had my own group of friends, and although I could tell she was pretty, she wasn't really my type. I had nothing to gain from talking to her. I was also pretty clever myself. It's not like I was the smartest guy in our class, but I was clever enough to get into a relatively good college without much effort. As such, my immediate concern during that high school year was securing myself a girlfriend. My first girlfriend that year was the team captain of the girls' basketball team. It took a few days, but I diligently waited for an opportunity when we were both alone on the court. Then I made my move. I went in to kiss her, and when she didn't push me back or pull away herself, I sealed the deal. But about a month after we started dating, she suddenly broke up with me. I thought we'd had a great time together. Then again, it's not uncommon for high school love affairs to be short and sweet. I asked her why she broke up with me, but she just kept on saying she didn't want to see me anymore, and I didn't get a reason out of her. It was a bit of a blow, but I recovered after a few days, and I started chasing after another girl. What really troubled me, though, was what happened afterwards. I dated 3 more girls, but one after another, they'd say they wanted to break up. I didn't think I was the nicest of guys, but I certainly wasn't that bad. Either way, all 3 of them broke up with me after less than a week of going out. Let me tell you, when that shit happens to you, you can't help but feel slightly depressed. If they had just rejected me when I asked them out, that would have been fine. But the fact they broke up with me after going out for such a short time implied I had some severe defect I wasn't aware of. My confidence was already in tatters by the midpoint of the first semester. That was the state I was in when Rin asked me out. Like I said, she wasn't my type, but I was so desperate I immediately accepted. I heard later from my friend who was with me at the time that when I said okay, Rin had smiled in a really crooked way. I still think back to it now. If only I hadn't accepted. Roughly twice a week, we'd visit each other's house and have sex. We ended up doing it in Rin's house more often, as her parents were divorced, and her rich dad had bought her her own place. Considering what we got up to, I'd actually class our relationship as friends with benefits rather than a couple. To be fair, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't enjoying the situation. Most guys dream about having a sex buddy. Then again, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were plenty of other guys who were after Rin, and when they found out I was dating her, they started giving me a hard time. I think it also had something to do with the fact that I was dating her after splitting up with so many others before. I think they thought I was just having sex with them one by one, moving on from one to the next. Strange thing was, a few weeks after they started giving me grief, I got an apology from them. At first, I thought they were gonna push me around a bit, but then I realized they looked kind of scared. Apparently, they had started receiving a ton of death threats via emails and letters ever since they'd been giving me trouble. They seemed to think I was the culprit behind it. When I told them it wasn't me, they just apologized again and walked away. This was fine in itself, but these death threats had been sent to other people in our class too. There was this girl I was friendly with, due to us both being on the school council. I'd heard from her that she had been receiving the threatening emails too, and it was becoming a problem. She tried getting the police involved, but as far as the police were concerned, death threats by email happened all the time, and unless something happened physically, they wouldn't be able to do anything. I was an idiot. I should have realized at this point that something was wrong. One day, as usual, I'd stayed around Rin's house. We'd finished up our homework and fell asleep together. For whatever reason, I started to feel particularly lightheaded that night and passed out with minimal difficulty. I woke up in the middle of the night and realized I couldn't move my arms or legs. I tried and tried again in the dark room, but my limbs wouldn't budge. I assumed I was still dreaming. But as my hazy, sleep-clogged mind became clear, I realized that the bed had been covered round and round in tape, with me still on it. A blue light suddenly flickered to my right, along with a sharp zapping sound. As I looked to the source of the sound, again the blue light flashed, illuminating Rin's face. She was sitting on a chair next to the bed with a stern expression. She was holding a stun gun. At first, I thought she was just playing a joke on me, but as she pressed the stun gun against my neck, I knew I was fucked. I panicked and struggled desperately to break free of the bonds, but to no avail. There was just too much damn tape tying me down. As I squirmed, Rin jumped on top of me and cried out hysterically.
"You're mine! No one else is allowed to touch you! I'm not giving you to anybody! Not to her, or her, or her!"
With that, she started to repeat all of the names of the girls I'd dated, or was even just friends with.
"Slut! Slut! Slut!"
Every time she shouted slut, she brought down the stun gun on my chest, blue light flaring again and again. I blacked out for a moment. As I came to, hazy and hoping this had all been a delusion, the torture continued.
Are you awake? Why is it that you cheat on me?
Wait, what?
It's her, isn't it? The girl in 2C?
The name of the girl that Rin mentioned was indeed a girl I fancied. As I said before, I didn't feel anything special towards Rin. She'd asked me out, and I only agreed on a whim. I considered her only as a sex friend, so it was natural that there was someone else I had the hots for. I had only told a few of my closest friends about my feelings towards that girl, but somehow Rin had gotten word of it. With the weapon in one hand, she questioned me again.
You like her, don't you?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Don't pretend.
I forgot to mention, but all through the conversation, she had been smiling. There seemed to be no emotion behind the clown mask she wore.
Come on, tell me. You like her, right?
I was crying at this point, my body involuntarily twitching. the room spinning slightly. What? No, I don't even know that girl.
You're lying again. I heard from Kay that you like her.
Kay, the friend she mentioned, was someone that I had known since I started high school. He was one of my closest friends.
How much do you like her?
I didn't say a word, and tried to look away from her face.
I'm asking you a question.
I remained silent.
I'm asking you a fucking question!
This continued for what I think was around 2 hours, but I'm not sure. It felt like time in that room passed 10 times slower. Please, just stop. I'm sorry. Rin looked me in the eyes.
If you tell me the truth, if you tell me that you love her, I'll let you go.
I like her. As soon as I said it, she forced the stun gun down on me. The pain was so intense. It was something humans aren't meant to endure. As she held her finger down on the switch, my eyes filled with white light. Then everything went black. I woke up to find myself still in Rin's room, no longer bound to the bed. As I frantically looked around for Rin, I noticed that the room wasn't any different to how it usually looked. There was no evidence of there ever being tape on the bed, and more importantly, no stun gun. The whole thing seemed like a bad dream, despite the fact I knew it wasn't. I lay in bed, too scared to move. The door swung open violently. Instinctively, I pulled the bedsheets over me and pretended I was still asleep. Rin entered the room.
Are you still asleep?
She jumped onto the bed and laid next to me, taking out her phone and holding it very close to my face. Squinting my eyes open ever so tightly, I just about made out what was on her phone. It was the number of the girl from Class 2C, along with a long text consisting of all of the embarrassing secrets I had only ever told my closest of friends. It also revealed details of all of the sexual acts that Rin and I had ever performed.
I'm gonna send this to her. What do you think?
I wanted to punch her, but resisting the urge, I continued my pretense and lay still.
I guess there's no way you can answer me if you're asleep.
The way she innocently laughed, despite everything that had happened, was truly terrifying. I heard a beep.
Oh no, I've sent it.
At that point, I wasn't sure I'd be able to leave the house alive without a fight. I gave it a few more minutes, and then pretended to wake up.
Oh, you're awake.
I didn't reply.
I don't think I need to tell you what I'd do if you talk about what happened tonight, right?
Again, I didn't reply.
I wonder, what'll happen to her if you talk?
I shivered. I won't tell anybody. She laughed again.
I'm not actually gonna hurt a girl, silly.
Rin didn't let me leave the house until the next morning when school started. I sat in class in a dazed state, unable to pay attention to the teacher. The way I saw it, I had 3 options. One was to go on with my life as if nothing had happened. I just had to make sure not to talk to any more girls while at school. The second was to go to the police. This would be best, but as far as I could tell, Rin had been very clever and left no evidence in the room. Most likely she would have hidden the stun gun, and the device hadn't left any marks on my body. Sadly, the police were far more likely to believe her story over mine. The last option was to confront Rin, or get rid of her. But that was out of the question, of course, as much as I would have liked to at that point. By the end of the day, I decided I should contact the police. Even if they couldn't arrest her, at least it would mean she wouldn't be able to do anything rash for the time being. But, of course, contacting the police wouldn't be easy, since Rin was watching me almost all of the time. If one of Rin's oblivious underlings told her that they'd seen me call someone, I could be in some real danger. It had also become clear during yesterday's events that that psycho had collected incriminating evidence on some of my friends. About what specifically, I don't know, but she used it to blackmail them. That explains why they told her who I was actually interested in. Rin was lying in wait for me just outside the main school entrance. As I saw her wave to me, I thought I was going to throw up. Next to her was my female friend from school council, the one who tried to contact the police about the anonymous threats. She lived in the same direction as Rin, who had organised that the three of us walk home together. Before we set off, Rin took a moment to subtly show me the contents of her bag. Inside was a knife. As we walked back, I seriously started considering option 3. If I was fast enough, I might be able to knock her out before she had a chance to go for the knife. She mumbled under her breath at random intervals.
I can slit her throat whenever I want to.
As soon as we were in a deserted spot, Rin took out the knife. The girl with us just stared, completely bewildered. Ignoring the girl, Rin looked at me straight in the eyes.
Do you love me? Or do you love her?
The girl let out a nervous giggle as if this was a joke, but as soon as she noticed I wasn't smiling, she too began to look worried. I realized at this point what I had to do. There was no way I could reason with Rin. When I didn't answer, she opened up her bag to take out her stun gun. Thinking that this was my only chance, I threw my bag at her with all my strength. Even if she was fucking nuts, she was still a girl, and the force of the bag sent her tumbling to the ground. I immediately grabbed the other girl's hand and ran. Even as we distanced ourselves, we could still hear Rin's demented screams. With both of our statements, Rin was taken into custody. She wasn't sent to prison. As suspected, she had been clever and had immediately disposed of the knife and the stun gun before the police came to her house. But, thankfully, since she had blackmailed so many other students, there was enough evidence to get her expelled from the school. Throughout the police investigation, I also discovered why those girls kept dumping me. Rin had been sending them death threats too. I was her target from the beginning. The way I look at all of this is that it was karma for me being such a cocky little shit during high school. Sadly, this story doesn't end on a happy note, but at least I can say that nobody got killed. And ever since, I haven't seen or heard from Rin. I really hope it stays that way. I am a 19-year-old female living in rural England. It's pretty much the middle of nowhere. Pokemon Go had just gone live here, and being a total freak for the series, I had to check it out immediately. I've been loving it so far. One feature in the game is that you can use an item called incense to attract more Pokemon. I found out fairly quickly that incense works a lot better on the move. If I stayed around my house while using it, I'd only ever attract the usual Pidgeys and Weedles. But if I used it whilst out jogging, I'd often come across more interesting and varied finds. since it lasts for 30 minutes after being activated. I'd been using the incense around 10 minutes into my jog, which was when I'd reached these woods which I run through. It's midday, so I'm not too worried as I'm making my way through the heart of the woods by myself, stopping sporadically to catch abras and slowpokes and whatnot. This is a hotspot for Pokemon, so my attention is fixed to the screen of my phone, my headphones blocking out all noise around me. That's why I didn't hear him approach. I was interrupted by a tap on my shoulder, which nearly gave me a heart attack. I whip out my earphones and spin to face whoever was there. It's some creepy, sweaty man in his mid-30s with a scruffy beard and wild hair. He was dressed in that army man, cheap camo jacket and trouser getup, almost like he was trying to blend into the surroundings. Instinctively, I freeze up. My mind goes blank, and all I can do is stare back at him. He doesn't say anything at first, his face doing all the talking. The intensity of his gaze was haunting. His eyes opened so wide, it was almost like he didn't have eyelids. Then, completely emotionless, in an almost robotic fashion, he says, "Give me a reason not to kill you." I can barely react. All I want to do is sprint the hell away, but my legs are set to hibernate mode. I can't even respond verbally to him. "No one would ever know it was me," he says, but not like it was directed at me, but to himself, like he was really contemplating it or convincing himself. Adrenaline was starting to take effect now, and I was pretty much ready to kick this guy in the sweet spot and make my escape. But after the most uncomfortable silence in existence, he turned around and calmly walked back through the thicket. I tear up with fear as this guy disappears out of sight, and then sprinted home as fast as my legs could propel me. Thankfully, he didn't follow. What worries me is that this is like future serial killer type of behavior. It felt like I was some sort of test run or something, like he was gauging my reaction. Trust me when I say that these woods are literally in the middle of nowhere, secluded to the point where I don't think I've ever seen another soul in there before this encounter. I haven't been out jogging since this happened, but when I do, I'll definitely be changing my route. This whole thing wasn't the game's fault, and I could have run into this weirdo anywhere, but it does go to show that you should always pay attention to your surroundings when playing the game. It's easy to let your guard down when your face is immersed in your smartphone, and your headphones are in. I was on a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of Chesapeake Bay, with about 7 other men, doing a shakedown test cruise. We planned to be out there for about 12 hours. It was the mid-1980s, not as reliable weather prediction resources. We get caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50 miles an hour range. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails, because the one fellow on board who was the best sailor sensed that the storm was almost on us, otherwise we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a security call on the radio. If you've spent time at sea, you'll know what I'm talking about. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility. But then, thankfully, it passed, and we would live. This was at about 3 PM, and although there was cloud cover of course, the ambient light was such that you could see for 2 miles in any given direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallower depths near land masses, dredge up a lot of things from the sea floor. We're all on deck, working lines and checking damage, and the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often use the saying, "the sea is confused." I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, and then submerges again. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man, a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, and then dove back under. So, maybe you need to know a few things about me at that moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had, at the time, about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, everything, all around the world. I wasn't the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I wasn't going to say anything. What could I say? I just saw a strange creature, take my word for it? The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D-Skipper or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked onto the steel lifeline, glad just to be alive, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years' experience in the surface navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes and then went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. No one else said that they had seen it. We sailed back to the pier later that day and didn't speak of it again. When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s or early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal and everyone loved him. I can attest to that, as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration that he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in his father and had a talk with him about spending more time with his son, and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy, model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see that the dad was playing basketball with his son after he had gotten home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day, Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called up the superintendent to let him know that he was going to fire him the next day after he had sobered up. My grandfather then warned the superintendent to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because Stanley was not a stable person. As it goes in these kind of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to fire Stanley himself. No one called my grandfather to let him know either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he would be able to deal with it in the morning. When the superintendent called him up, Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched all of the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. it was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was hysterical, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shot him himself. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were both dead, but what was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he would never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police, who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a list. A hit list of all the people he was going to kill, and all of the addresses of those people that had been retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would have never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed by Stanley as well. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling to me. This happened around 1971 or 1972, when my mother was about 14 or 15 years old. The incident occurred in a heavily wooded area near Montevallo, Alabama. My mother is the oldest of 5 children. She has 3 sisters and a brother who's the baby of the family. One weekend in the cooler months of the fall, my grandfather decided to take the whole family out for target practice with a rifle. That included my grandmother, my mother, and all of the aunts and uncles. My mother grew up quite poor, and they didn't always live in the best of neighborhoods, so my grandfather wanted to teach the kids how to defend themselves with a rifle if need be. Like I said, it was later in the fall, so the trees were bare, and there were lots of leaves on the ground. The wooded area was just off a dirt road, so this was a fairly rural area they were in. Since it was so far off the beaten path, my grandfather became startled when he heard the roar of a car engine so deep in the woods. My mother remembers the car as being a blue Ford Galaxy, something a little like this. Despite the fact that my grandfather had a gun, he totally freaked out and told my grandma and the kids to hide under a pile of leaves in the woods. He hid with them. The man in the driver's seat got out, dragged a woman's body out of the car, and just dumped her there in the woods and drove away. After my grandfather was sure that the man had left, everyone came out of hiding, and the woman who had been dragged out of the car sat up and stared them straight in the face. She was wearing a wig and a pair of eyeglasses. My mother and her whole family were relieved to see that she was still alive. My grandfather asked the woman if she needed help, but she said no, and that she'd be fine. She didn't appear to be injured, and obviously didn't want help. She hadn't put up a fight with the man when she was dragged out of the car, so she must have known the guy. Either way, my grandfather cut the shooting lesson short, and decided to rush the kids home, just to be on the safe side. On the trail back to the dirt road where my grandfather had parked the car, they passed the man in the blue Ford Galaxy, driving out of the woods. My mum looked over and noticed that he had a huge machete laying across the front seat beside him. My grandfather made sure that the man could see he was carrying a rifle, but everyone was careful not to give away what they had just seen. The man struck up small talk with my grandfather, asking him about what they were doing out in the woods. My grandfather explained that he had just taken the whole family out for target practice. The man told him to have a nice day and continued driving. The next day, my grandfather went back out to the same spot in the woods. There wasn't a body there. However, he did find the woman's wig, her purse, some Kleenex, and a pair of glasses. He collected the items and took them home. My mother became hysterical when he walked in the door carrying that stuff. She started screaming, "He killed that lady." My grandfather ended up taking the items to the police station. It turns out that that area of the woods was known for having shallow graves and being a dumping site for bodies. Early the next morning, as soon as my grandmother arrived at work, she called my mum just before the kids left for school. She told them not to take the bus that day, and that she would come home and pick them up, and that she would be home soon. On her way to work, she noticed the same Ford Galaxy, waiting at the kids' bus stop. My mother never heard anything else about it after that. A buddy of mine clued me into this sub a while back, knowing that I'm a total sucker for creepy stories. Reading the posts that search and rescue guy made a while back, I felt compelled to share a few experiences of my own, mostly because his stories struck a chord with me as being similar, at least in tone, to a few of mine, even though his are definitely a tad weirder. I never got around to it, but I have a little free time at the moment, so why not? Thought I'd share, cause I feel you guys will appreciate these stories, and because I'd like to get them off my chest. Talking about the bizarre to others always tends to remove a bit of the gnawing feeling that surrounds it, even if the respite that results is brief. I've worked as a private investigator for around 5 or 6 years now, running my own business. It's usually a pretty bad idea to just up and start an independent PI company as your gateway to the job. In fact, it's pretty darn stupid. But I live in a town that's small enough that I was able to make it work. My first year or so was pretty rocky as I tried to adjust to the job, but having a couple of friends in the field to give me pointers here and there definitely helped. I eventually began to hit my stride, and as my reputation increased, so too did my client base. I won't be specific about where I live, nor will I use any real names. As a PI, people come to me with some pretty personal shit, and it's universally taboo to just go sharing the specifics with the world. The extent I'll admit is that I'm in Canada, and that I'm in a small, semi-remote town surrounded by vast boreal forest. Not the kind you'd go exploring or hiking through with friends, but the kind that you would stay away from, because, much like the stereotype, there are bears and caribou all over the shop. Trust me, caribou will fuck your day up seriously bad. So, with that little bit of preamble out of the way, I suppose I'll start. I tend to get a lot of cases from paranoid spouses, and most I'll take, however absurd. I'm in no position to turn down a paying customer, and when they turn out to be correct, it always feels good to help them out an unfaithful partner. This case, despite having a reasonably explainable conclusion, was creepy enough to have definitely caused me to think a little more about what to accept and what to decline. Roughly 2 years ago, I get a cold call from what sounds like an older man. He asks to make sure he's called the right place, and when I tell him he has, he immediately launches into a particularly long-winded rant about how his wife is plotting against him, and how she's planning to take him out. I try to get him to calm down, and ask when he'd be able to come over to the office, so we could discuss things over a coffee, what he should bring, hash out whether or not this was a legitimate case, and if so, negotiate a fee. He's adamant that he needs to see me as soon as possible, so he comes in a couple of hours later. I don't have any cases at the time, so I'm all for it. He's an older gentleman, in around his late 50s, early 60s probably, and is visibly shaken when he shows up. We talk for a little while, and he's definitely calmed down by this point, but he's still obviously frightened. He tells me that his wife has been going out to meet with other elderly women for a sort of book club type deal, and that he's sure that they're all out for his blood. Things get really interesting when he reveals that every morning, around 4 AM, he's woken up by an abnormally loud sound, like dogs barking and growling frantically. He tells me that he always wakes up to see his wife standing in the bedroom doorway, and that two other elderly women resembling a few of her friends are always standing motionless behind her, making no movements, just staring. The creepy part is that his wife is still in bed with him, sleeping. They don't move as long as he doesn't, but he tells me that as soon as he performs anything noticeable, they stumble off before he has a chance to put his glasses on to get a better look. The few times that he had gone to check, he found his back door opened, but never anything else out of place. I'm a little weirded out, and at first think it must be sleep paralysis. But the fact that a previously closed door is open, and the fact that he's able to effortlessly move around rules that out. I ask if he has a carbon monoxide detector in his room. He tells me he does, and that it hasn't ever gone off. I ask about things like his address, when his wife usually leaves, when he usually leaves, the location of her book club, pictures of his wife, her friends, things like that. We come to an agreement. I take the case, and he goes off on his way. I head off to his place that night, and park my car on his street, in a location in which I can see his front door and the gate leading into his backyard. I set up my camera and turn on a podcast, since I have to be there before he goes to sleep to ensure I don't miss it, since it's possible that they could arrive before 4 AM. I'm out there for around 6 hours with no signs of any activity. The roads are dark, save for dim country streetlights, and more or less barren. There's this almost piercing feeling of silence and isolation, not unlike the town had suddenly become entirely deserted, like I'm the only living thing outside on that night. My podcast had long ended, and a permeating essence of dread enticed me to turn the music that had replaced it off, for fear of unspeakable whispers worming their way into the silence between guitar strums. 3:30 AM sharp, and almost as if on cue, the sound of a dog barking nearly gives me a heart attack. What's worse is how incredibly loud and oddly distorted it is. That is, it's odd until I realize that it's multiple dogs, as if every dog on the block started barking in eerie unison. This is when I catch a glimpse of them in my rearview mirror. Two small, shriveled figures, and one taller, more lithe one, all slowly stumbling across the sidewalk, all clad in white dresses, appearing so suddenly, it's like NPCs have just entered my draw distance. The tint on my windows ensures they don't see me as they pass by, but I'm nonetheless silent as a mouse, deathly afraid that one might peer over into my window as they pass. Their footsteps echo as they pass my car, and as they do, my blood runs cold. It is not, in fact, 3 old ladies. It's 2 old ladies, dragging along one lifeless, stark white mannequin, rigid like a corpse, fresh from the grave, and dressed as the old man's wife. I try to shake myself out of my daze, and begin to take a few pictures with one cam, video them with the other. Sure enough, they turn right down his driveway, their mannequin in tow, and one of them unlocks the back gate, vanishing from view. I check the footage and pictures to make sure they're clear. Trying to get over the horrid bizarreness of the whole situation, I try to think of something, since it's obviously not a good idea to just leave the old couple there, with a pair of creepy old ladies who are probably suffering from dementia or something. Since it appears they're usually watching him for half an hour or so, I assume they've probably no intent to harm him, but one can never be sure. I pull out my cell and call up his phone, hoping to try and drive them out. A few minutes later, they're shambling away down the street, mannequin grinding against the pavement. I wait until they're out of view before letting out a breath of relief. The guy doesn't initially believe me when I tell him what happened, but I show him the pictures and the video, and he goes pale. Despite the definite creep factor involved, he reacts instead by letting out the deepest sigh of relief I think I've ever heard. He mumbles something, and I can see tears starting to run down his cheeks. He smiles a little melancholically and thanks me, saying that he has to apologize to his wife for not trusting her and not talking to her about it first. I'm not entirely sure what happened after, but I assume he took the photos to someone, as the visits stopped happening after that. I'm not sure of the details, but apparently the women had pretty much gone off their rockers due to old age. His wife had given one of them the keys, in case they ever wanted to come over. I honestly don't understand the logic behind this one, other than she's old, I guess. Either way, I believe the two of them are in a home of some kind now, and the husband made up with his wife pretty easily. I was out driving alone in a national park. There was a huge clear moon, the kind of moonlight you can read by. The road went straight along the bottom of a wide, flat, mostly barren valley, then banked up sharply to the left onto the ridge. It was about 10 p.m, and I drove through the valley on full alert, watching for animals and loving the scenery in this crazy bright moonlight. When I hit the curve and went into the sharp uphill left, I saw something through my side window. A white thing. It was rapidly getting larger in my peripheral, as though it had been moving parallel to me, but the turn in the road meant I was now in its path. So I turned my head and looked directly at it. It was white, man-shaped but without genitals, and completely naked. A deathly, nauseating white and greasy shine, completely hairless. It was crawling on its hands and knees, but it was half the size of the car and moving unnaturally fast. It had a rubbery face, distorted by what looked like a scream, but it wasn't making any noise. The look on its face, I can't even tell you. I can still make myself feel sick from the memory. I believe that it was intelligent, and that it wanted to tear me apart with its teeth. The speed was horrifying. It went from being a small white dot to spitting distance, all in the time it took to make that turn. When I unfroze myself and hit the gas, it was on the road, and I braced for it to run into my door. And then it was gone. The rearview mirror showed me nothing. I've never told anybody. I've seen a few glitchy, ghosty things over my many years, but nothing that has frightened me like that. I can't seem to find any reference to anything like it, and I'd like to know if this thing is known folklore. I looked into skinwalkers and wendigos, and it's a case of almost but not quite. Can skinwalkers ever appear without their skins? Then maybe. Can wendigos be stocky instead of skinny? Then again, maybe. This happened in Newfoundland. Newfoundlanders have no trouble telling ghost stories, and a lot of them believe in fairies. But I've not heard of a creature like this. As for it being a bear, Newfoundland only has black bears. Hell, I even tried to tell myself it was a badly lost wet polar bear. But when I say this thing was crawling, I mean I could see its legs below the knee. I was very close to it by the end, and it looked like a crawling man. I spent a lot of time in that area, and encouraged storytelling in the bar, but nothing like this ever got mentioned. But, as I said, I never told this story either. The degree of fear involved somehow put it in its own category, as if it would be very, very bad luck to speak about it. I never thought I believed in them, but I think it was a demon. Quick backstory here. I'm 18, and I live in a lower middle class townhome complex with my divorced mum and my little brother. My mum was out of state for a week at the time, and my little brother was staying at our dad's house. I was an 18-year-old with the house to himself for a week, with a mum who was perfectly fine with me smoking weed in the house, and gave me permission to have a few friends over while she was gone. Every teen's dream growing up, right? Yeah, except it ended up a little different than that. The first day, I come home from a 10-hour shift at the gas station I work at, half a mile down the road from my house. I walk home, head into my basement, smoke a bowl, and fall asleep with my cat. A few hours later, I wake up with this uneasy feeling. It's 1 a.m, and I hear footsteps upstairs. My cat's on my bed, and my dog's at a dog daycare center for the week. I hear drawers upstairs being opened, and I immediately grab my switchblade and call 911. They send a squad car out, and I stay on the phone. I hear someone coming downstairs. With my bed just being in the basement due to the bedroom essentially being the size of a closet, I'm the first thing they'll see when they come down. I jumped to my feet, dropped my phone, and drew my switchblade. The door opens, the light turns on, and in walks a man, wearing a backpack and holding a crowbar. I'm around 5'10", 140 pounds, scrawny and shirtless, and I'm just standing there with a mere 4-inch blade, locking eyes with this man I've never seen before in my life. He jumped just as high as I did when he saw me. With a surge of foolish confidence, I point the knife towards him and told him not to step any further. Funny, considering his crowbar had a solid foot reach over my knife. He shouted, "What the fuck?" "Bro, we didn't think anyone was here. I'm not looking for a fight, man." I hear quick and heavy footsteps coming down, and a voice saying, "Yo, what the fuck are you doing down here?" A second man emerges through the doorway, this one holding a pistol, and he points it at me as soon as he realizes I'm there. His eyes light up, as do mine, as I realize who I'm looking at. An old elementary school friend who I drifted out of contact with. I had some friends who started talking to him recently, but I heard that he turned into a recreational Xanax addict, and I didn't want to fuck with that, so I never bothered getting back in contact. Turns out, that's exactly why they were robbing my seemingly empty house. Xanax money. "Josh?" he said, in a questioning voice as he lowered the gun. Fuck, dude. I don't know what to say. At this point, the door slammed open, and the police rushed into the house, eventually coming downstairs and arresting the two of them. It didn't even dawn on me until one of the cops jokingly mentioned that I had a bong on my bed, and roughly an ounce of weed on the desk, and the basement must have smelled pretty strongly. Luckily, the cop ended up being cool, and just saying, "I honestly don't care. They need to legalize it anyways. After what you've been through, you could use a joint." But I never said that to you. So, yeah. I'm not a storyteller by any means, but I thought you guys would enjoy that. My dad worked in the offshore drilling industry in Nigeria way back in the 90s. Him and some French companymen were heading out to a platform when their ship was assaulted and boarded by modern-day pirates. 5 of the Frenchmen were beheaded before my dad and the rest of the crew were able to take back the ship. He told me about this when I was 8 years old, and I innocently asked him if he had ever killed anyone. He said he wasn't entirely sure, but when you smack a dude with an iron bar around the head and he falls into the sea and doesn't come up, he's probably dead. He still has nightmares about it to this day. That's just one of the stories from his time in Africa. The company he worked for, Albert Albella Catering, had a compound outside of Lagos, Nigeria. It had 14-foot-high concrete walls, with battlements, razor wire, and sniper towers. It also had a full-time security staff of mercenaries from the Congo. One night, some Igbo tribesmen decided to raid the compound. About 100 of these guys assaulted the compound with machetes in hand, throwing thick rugs over the razor wire, and even having some of their guys lay across it, and their buddies run over the top. The mercenaries managed to kill all of them, but I think 5 of the mercs were killed with machetes. My dad said they were burning bodies for 2 days after that. I was around a friend's house one night. There were several of us there, watching TV, drinking, smoking, just hanging out, being kids, whatever. Without warning, a group of masked men with handguns burst in the back door and started screaming. At this point, I know exactly what's going on. I was familiar with similar scenarios already at that point in my life, so I was thinking, just be cool, they'll get what they want and leave. However, the one guy who was doing all the talking started pistol whipping and kicking people, mainly one of my friends, Jeff, who was in the front of the room. All of a sudden, we heard a gunshot. A gunshot in a small room is fucking loud, man. I've been around guns most my life, either at ranges or out hunting, but never in a small, closed room. My ears are ringing, and I'm thinking, that fucking moron just put a bullet in the ceiling. The cops will be here any second. All was quiet for a moment. We slowly get up and look around. Everyone except Jeff. The would-be burglar had shot him through the armpit, and the bullet went through both of his lungs. He died about 30 seconds later on his living room floor. All for nothing. The police didn't get there for about half an hour. A few days later, the getaway driver and accomplices turned themselves in. They ratted on the shooter. Long story short, he's serving about 50 years in prison. He probably won't make it out. I've never been a believer in the paranormal, or anything that didn't have a rational explanation. That is, until I saw what I saw. I have a daughter named Ellie. Her mother and I split up when she was 6 years old, and because of some problems that her mother was having, we decided that it would be best if she lived with me. My grandpa left my dad his old house in his will, and my dad had it fixed up with the intent to sell it. But with the situation, we decided that I'd move in and rent the house from him. The house was perfect for myself and Ellie. It was a small 2-bedroom house, and it was out of the way from everything. The only downside was that the bedrooms didn't have closets, but we didn't have a whole lot, so I knew we could make it work. After our very first night of staying in the house, Ellie came to me and said that someone was in her room. I can't remember the exact conversation, but I basically told her that she was just imagining things because it was a new, possibly scary environment. That night, I walked her around the house, showing her that everything was locked up. I took her into her bedroom and looked under her bed, checked her window and looked behind every nook and cranny basically. I managed to convince her that there was no way that anyone could get in to do her any harm. I told her that I wouldn't let anyone hurt her, and with the help of a nightlight, I was able to get her to go to bed. The next morning, Ellie again complained that there was someone in her room, and she didn't want to stay in the house anymore. She wanted to go live with my parents, her grandma and pa. I had honestly never seen her this upset. I told her that I would sleep in her room that night, to prove that there was nothing to be scared of. I brought my blankets and pillows into Ellie's room, and made myself a comfy spot beside her bed. We both said our goodnights, and it didn't take me long to fall asleep. I'm not sure what time it was, but I woke up to the sound of metal softly clanging together. It took me a minute to focus my eyes, and the first thing I noticed was that Ellie had left her bed and snuggled up with me on the floor. At first I thought I imagined the noise, but then I heard it again. Ellie's nightlight was on, so there was a soft orange glow illuminating the room. And even though I could make out things in the room pretty clearly, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. As I mentioned earlier, there were no closets in the room, so I had bought some racks to hang our clothes on. Her hanging clothes were the first thing I noticed moving. The clanging was the sound of hangers hitting each other and sliding on the rack. Then the clothes parted, almost as if you were going to open the curtains on a window to look outside, and the shadowy figure of someone or something's head appeared in the gap of the clothes. I was paralyzed. I wanted to grab Ellie and run as fast as I could, but I couldn't do anything. My body wouldn't allow me to do so. The only thing I could do was keep my eyes fixated on whatever was staring at me and my daughter. "What is that, Daddy?" A tiny whisper came from behind me. "Shh," was the only thing I managed to get out. I can't tell you how long I laid there staring at whatever it was, but it felt like an eternity. Eventually, this thing backed away, disappeared, whatever you want to say it did. It didn't matter to me. It was gone, and so were we. I took Ellie out of the room and put her in my bed, and I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. The next day, I gave her what she wanted. We moved in with her grandma and grandpa until I was able to get a place of our own. This was a little over 4 years ago, and I still get goosebumps if Ellie brings it up, or even just now while writing this. I've never been that scared in my life, and I doubt I ever will be again. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but I saw something strange in the woods outside of Homer, Nebraska. There's an old graveyard out here that's infamous for having a witch buried there, and is kind of a local spot for kids to go and scare themselves. Most of the land out there is flat, and is used for farming, but this graveyard sits on the edge of a big hill, and is surrounded by thick woods. One night, at around midnight, me and 5 of my friends decide to go out there in the woods and find that witch's grave, because the one in the actual graveyard is fake, and supposedly the real one is out in the forest. So we begin our adventure trekking through the dark forest. It doesn't take us long to find the real grave, as a couple of people I was with had been there before. We stick around for a couple of minutes, just fucking around and trying to scare each other, when we all just get this instinctual feeling of dread. I know a lot of stories talk about this, but it's a very real feeling, like your body responding to danger before you can even realize what's going on. It's probably worth mentioning that as a kid, I lived in a supposedly haunted house, and I'd never felt this feeling before. We decided to get the fuck away from the grave. Now, this is where us, being stupid teenagers, almost got ourselves killed. One of the kids I was with says that some people grow pot around this area, and that he knows where to find some. So, even though we all clearly felt something was wrong, we decided, fuck it, let's get high. As we started walking back through the woods, I began to feel like we were being watched, and every now and then, I'd hear the rustling of leaves or the crackling of undergrowth behind me. I told my friends we needed to move faster, but they were all just saying I was trying to fuck with them. Eventually, as we keep walking, we stumble upon a clearing, and we can't really see anything ahead of us. When all of a sudden, my friend starts taking off for the other end of the clearing, and we all go after him. All around us, we can hear cattle freaking the hell out. After we get a couple of 100 yards away from the cows, something scares them way worse than us. I mean, I've never heard a sound like that coming from an animal. It was a horrible mix of the cows being scared to death by something, and an unearthly, ear-shattering scream. Now, by this time, I realized that we were lost in the middle of the woods at 2 a.m, with something stalking us. I finally convinced everyone that we should change our direction so that we can get to the road. And about 30 minutes later, we're making progress, as someone spots some headlights way out in front of us that we can see on top of the hill we're on. We start walking down towards the road, when I noticed that those sounds from behind us earlier had started up again. I turn to my friend and tell him to point his iPhone flashlight back behind us. I only saw something for a moment, but about 30 yards behind us, I saw a blackish-brown figure with yellow eyes lean its head from behind a tree and then quickly duck back behind it. This is what really freaked me out, as animals around here don't sneak around and duck behind trees. I get the best look out of all of my friends, and the head looked kind of like a gaunt German shepherd with a little resemblance to a human face. The eyes and mouth looked far more human than dog. There aren't any wolves or bears around here. As far as I know, there are no large predators here at all. It was a little bit elevated, but it was still eye level with me. I'm 6'2", and this thing was at least 6 foot, so I'm pretty sure it was standing on 2 legs. At this point, I take the fuck off. I swear I've never ran that fast in my life. We make it to the road in under 5 minutes, but realize we came out the other side of the woods and have to walk back 3 miles down the road to our cars. It was honestly the scariest night of my life. Whatever it was, wasn't human or animal. I've been back there multiple times, but never at night now. I went camping with a mate that I'd grown up with, an Aboriginal bloke. It was late at night, and I got up to pee. We were way inland, behind some rock hills. Tall, dead cane grass was everywhere, and I couldn't see far. After I relieved myself, I heard my mate calling me, but it was coming from away from the camp. That was strange, as I'd just left him in camp. I waited. He called again, no mistaking his voice. I called back, and started walking out towards him. This went on for a little while, changing direction sometimes, calling me on. Suddenly, someone grabs me from behind, and I leap out of my skin and spin around. I already realized that I'd walked deep into the cane grass and was disorientated. I turned to see a very somber face, my mate's face, deadly serious. I'm thrown into confusion, and I'm a little angry. What are you doing? You're calling from in front of me. How did you get behind me? It isn't me, he says. We stand still. It's completely silent. I'm starting to get mad, but I can see the fear in his face. I wait. Sure enough, that voice calls again. But my friend's right there. That's impossible. Now I'm fucking freaked. I'm all wide-eyed and staring at him. He whispers, "Bad spirit. We'll go back to camp straight away." Like I said, I was disorientated, but if I knew where the hell camp was, I would have run straight up his back to get there. At the camp, he tells me how this has happened for eons. People get called away by familiar voices. Sometimes they make it back to tell what happened, and sometimes, especially if they're young, they perish. If my friend hadn't heard me and come and tracked me down, well... Before I begin, I should describe myself a bit. I was born in the States, and I was raised around people who don't believe we're alone in the universe. I believe that children hold a type of intuition that many of us have either lost or chosen to ignore. In the summer of 2009, my family traveled to Iraq, quite a few years after the war was quote-unquote over. My father hadn't seen his side of the family for over 20 years, and figured it was the perfect time for us to meet with them and learn about our culture. Iraq back in 2009 was just as terrible as you probably imagine it to be. Hot, no electricity, terror groups running around. But still, I was excited to explore such an ancient country. Dark history has always fascinated me. One night, my entire family had walked 2 blocks down to visit my cousin at her house. I said I'd meet them there because I was still getting ready. When I was done, I took 2 of my cousins with me. One of them was 4 years old, and the other was barely 2, so I had to carry him. Exactly behind our home is an abandoned house that the residents of the village refer to as the Jinn house. Jinn in Arabic means genie, but not the ones that grant wishes. Jinns are almost always bad, and do terrible things to either scare or harm people. Here's a picture of the house that I took. Multiple families had tried to move into that house, but were either scared out, or a tragedy would occur that made them move. The last tenants suffered a lot. At first, it was just silly things, like waking up with the TV set upside down. Then, every other morning, their furniture would be outside of the house. The youngest son began sleepwalking, and my cousins had even seen him doing it. He'd often walk to the cemetery and back at night, without even knowing he was doing it. One night, while sleepwalking, the boy picked up a gun and killed one of his sisters. The house caught on fire, and the family had to run out. The boy doesn't remember anything, and the remaining sister is now medically insane. I took the 2 boys and started walking past the Jinn house, because it was the only way I knew to get to my cousin's house. The 2-year-old was in my arms, and the 4-year-old was holding my left hand and walking with me. Walking past the Jinn house, which was on my left, I tried not to look at it because it really freaked me out. There were a bunch of broken TV sets all around the house, and all the windows were busted. Still, something made me look. On the roof of the house, I saw something that could only be described as having the body of a donkey, but the way it was sitting looked exactly like how a cat would sit. I stared at it for probably 10 seconds, when both of the little boys started screaming at the same time. The 2-year-old was facing behind me, since I was holding him up to my chest, so there was no way he was seeing what I was seeing. I felt like he sensed that something wasn't right. The longer I looked at the thing, I began to notice that it had these eyes that weren't a color I could explain. They weren't visible in the dark, but at the same time, I saw right into them. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It started to stand up, And that's when I picked up the 4-year-old, who was also screaming bloody murder, and ran as fast as I could away from that thing. I rarely talk about it, because I don't want to let my brain process the memory any more than it already has. I know what I saw, and it felt like it was something above human understanding. Whatever I saw that day, I know that in that moment of looking at it, it was shifting form. It wasn't solid, not like you and I. Its shape was constantly changing, while still remaining the same. It didn't have to show itself in its entirety for me to see what it was. I know it doesn't make any sense, but I truly believe I saw something not from this world, and that's why I had trouble understanding what I was seeing. It's been 6 years since then, and I ended up moving to Iraq the year after this happened. I've been back to that house multiple times, but I haven't seen that figure since. But I do still feel a presence whenever I walk by it, even though it's been abandoned for years. I've seen some really weird things here, and I don't have logical explanations for anything I've seen so far.